humid Sunday afternoon when the church called for a special deliverance service. Pastor Evans had been receiving calls for weeks. People claiming strange occurrences in their homes, unsettling dreams, and a general sense of something off in the air. The church had a reputation for its healing services, and people came from miles away for these gatherings. But this service felt different from the start. It wasn't just the oppressive heat or the lingering storm clouds outside. It was something in the air, something I couldn't quite name but could feel deep in my bones. I'd been part of Pastor Evans' congregation for years. My name is Marcus, and I've always been a believer in the power of prayer, in the strength of faith. I had seen strange things happen before during our services, people speaking in tongues, others collapsing into fits of emotion, but what happened that day shook me to my core. The church was packed with people who had come for deliverance, and there was a palpable tension in the room. As we began with the usual hymns, something felt off. The lights overhead flickered every so often, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. And then there was the water fountain. It was an old fixture at the back of the church, near the entrance. Normally, it was nothing more than a bubbling fountain that people used to fill cups or dip their hands in after prayer. But that day, it was different. Every so often, a low moaning sound would come from it. Not the usual gurgle of water, but something deeper, more hollow, like the groan of an old door being pushed open. I glanced at it a few times, feeling the hairs on my neck stand on end, but tried to focus on the service. Pastor Evans took to the pulpit, his voice strong as always, though there was a weariness behind his eyes. He spoke about faith, about the power of belief to overcome darkness, and then he moved into the deliverance prayers. That's when it started. About halfway through the service, a woman stood up in the back of the congregation. Her name was Julia. I had seen her at services before, but only in passing. She had a quiet demeanor, always sitting in the back pews, never drawing much attention to herself. But today she stood up, hands raised, and declared that she had been delivered from a demon. "Praise God," she shouted, her voice loud and clear. "I've been freed from the demon that's haunted me for years." The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and Pastor Evans invited her to the front to share her testimony. As she walked down the aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her smile seemed too wide, her steps too light, as if she were floating instead of walking. And those shadows, I had seen them flicker on the walls all morning, but now they seemed to move with her. It wasn't just the dimming lights. I could swear the shadows had a life of their own, twisting and curling like smoke, slithering along the edges of the room, drawn to Julia. She took the microphone and began to speak, her voice confident and sure. She talked about her struggles, about the strange things that had happened in her home, objects moving on their own, whispering voices at night, dark figures at the foot of her bed. And then she claimed that through prayer, she had been delivered, that the demon had left her body and she was finally free. But as she spoke, that unsettling feeling in my gut grew stronger. The lights flickered again, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move near the water fountain. A shadow, darker than the others, seemed to slip past the pews and vanish into the air. I turned to look, but it was gone. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few others glanced around uneasily, their eyes darting toward the shadows at the edges of the room. Pastor Evans seemed to sense it too, though he kept his focus on Julia, nodding along as she spoke. That's when the moaning from the water fountain grew louder. The congregation fell silent, the sound echoing through the church, low and mournful. Julia faltered for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the back of the room. I watched her closely, and in that instant, I saw her smile falter too. There was something behind her eyes, something dark and cold, a glimmer of malice that hadn't been there before. I don't know what made me do it, but I stood up. I couldn't just sit there and watch anymore. "Pastor," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "something's not right." All eyes turned to me, but I didn't care. The shadows seemed to gather around Julia, growing darker, thicker, swirling at her feet. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw them. Shadow entities like thin, elongated figures, hunched and distorted, moving just beyond the edges of the light. They clung to the walls, to the ceiling, creeping closer and closer to Julia as she stood there, her eyes widening in realization. "I am free," she repeated, but her voice was weaker now, trembling. Pastor Evans stepped forward, his face pale. "Julia," he said gently, "are you sure you've been delivered?" Her hands clenched the microphone, her knuckles white. "I am free," she insisted, but the shadows began to writhe around her, almost as if they were feeding off her words, growing stronger. And then the lights went out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, the moaning from the water fountain rose to a deafening wail, like the sound of 1,000 tortured souls crying out at once. The air grew heavy with the stench of sulfur, and I felt something cold brush past me. A presence, dark and malevolent. Screams erupted from the congregation as people scrambled to their feet, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows had taken over, filling every inch of the church, moving like black smoke, suffocating and cold. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the lights flickered back on. Julia was on the floor, writhing, her body contorted in unnatural ways. The shadows were still there, but they were retreating now, slipping away into the corners of the room, back toward the water fountain. Pastor Evans was praying over her, his voice loud and forceful, commanding whatever had a hold of her to leave. It took a few minutes, but eventually Julia's body stilled. She lay there, breathing heavily, her eyes closed. The shadows were gone, the church was silent, and the only sound left was the soft bubbling of the water fountain. Later, after the service had ended and most of the congregation had left, I stayed behind with Pastor Evans. Julia was resting, her face pale but peaceful. The shadows hadn't returned, but the uneasy feeling still lingered. "Do you think she was ever really delivered?" I asked him, my voice quiet. Pastor Evans shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but something was using her, something dark. It wanted us to believe she was free, but I think it was only lying in wait." I looked back at the water fountain, its soft gurgling almost soothing now, but I would never forget the sound it had made, the way the shadows had moved, the way they had clung to Julia like they were a part of her. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that move in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to slip through. I may never know what really happened that day, but I do know one thing: the shadows are never truly gone. They're always just waiting for the light to go out.